podcast. My name is Joshua Minchin and I'm a reporter here at Lloyd's List. As the clock ticks down on 2024 and 2025 begins, shipping is bracing itself for yet another unpredictable year. Reading the runes of this industry is often a futile and thankless task, with predictions regularly wiped out just hours after they are made. But, nevertheless, to prepare you for the new year, the Lloyd's List editorial team is going to be bringing you several mini episodes of the podcast over the next couple of weeks, in which they will discuss the things they are looking out for in 2025. We'll be talking about decarbonisation, risk and compliance, the container, tanker and dry bulk markets, as well as the marine insurance sector too. But to kick things off, Editor-in-Chief Richard Meade and our Asia-Pacific editor Cichen Shen sat down to take a bird's-eye view of the industry and reveal what they'll be waiting for in 2025. Well, Richard, Cichen, thank you so much for joining me as we, I suppose, end 2024 and then look forward to 2025. Shipping is notoriously hard to predict, I know it's a very difficult question to ask, but we always say at Lloyd's List that we provide the stories that are shaping shipping. With that in mind, Richard, what stories do you think will shape shipping into next year? What should we look out for?
Well, the two big obvious ones, one is an internal shipping one and one is an external shipping one. The obvious one is carbon. We have the big pivotal moment in shipping at the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, where finally we're going to get to see some of the detail around what carbon pricing looks like. Will it be a levy? Will it be a levy and a fuel standard? Will it be some sort of tax? We don't know, but we know roughly what it looks like. Frankly, the detail doesn't really matter as long as there is enough there that allows the industry to move on. And it will need to move on with investment in fuel supply, investment in pretty much everything from ordering new ships to the fuel infrastructures that will basically see shipping through to 2050. So there is a huge amount riding on this. If it goes one way and we get what we hope for, which is some clarity over carbon pricing that allows us to move to a zero carbon future, hitting the waypoints at 2030, 2040, and then ultimately net zero by 2050, great. But don't expect any immediate resolution on all of those things. It will be a slog towards 2050. If we don't, however, what we end up with is a fragmented, fractured regulatory landscape that is going to be much more costly. It is not going to achieve anything near net zero by anywhere near 2050. And ultimately, it is going to be much more complex and much more complicated for the shipping industry for the next 20 years at least. So it is a big pivotal point in our future, and I think a lot is riding on that. And I think what we've seen this year is a lot of people essentially waiting to see what happens next. The other big macro factor for me, of course, is Trump. We have a second round of Trump 2.0. He takes the hot seat on January the 20th. We are already seeing trade lanes adjusting to the somewhat unpredictable expectations around what a second bout of Trumponomics actually means. Obviously, tariffs are going to be high on the agenda. We've seen the initial output of what happens when he takes to social media to announce policy through tweets. We don't know. We don't know what's going to happen, but obviously we're all looking at China, and I think Cichen is going to probably give us the Asia view in terms of what that means. But there's also, again, on the climate side, we've got a very climate skeptic US president coming in. I don't think that's going to be enough to derail what happens immediately within the IMO. So I'm counting the Trump factor out from that decision. But a more climate skeptic US is going to have an impact in terms of decision making. And obviously, we've seen over the last year the real impact of legislation under Biden, like the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the investment that has fueled. Will Trump essentially perform a U-turn on that? We don't know. But I think there is going to be real fallout from that. And then there's obviously the big security issues around Trump as well. We're pretty certain that we're going to see a return to maximum pressure on Iran. But the big swing factor is how he's going to approach Russia. He's obviously promised quite publicly that he is going to seek a resolution to the Ukraine war. I mean, I don't think anyone's particularly holding their breath for him to deliver the day one promise that he's going to somehow find a solution to that. But the implications of shipping are around the complexity of sanctions and whether we have sanctions that are aligned across Western governments, or the US going one way and the EU, UK, and other G7 members going another way. So there's a huge amount of big swing factors on the geopolitical front, I guess, that are going to determine the big stuff at the top. I've got other things I want to talk about, but maybe Cichen. What do you think? Well, let's start with the Trump thing. How do you see Trump coming in and how that's going to affect decisions next year for shipping?
Obviously, things are happening on a sort of multiple levels. I mean, as you mentioned, the tariff war between U.S. and China will actually have a significant impact on at least the container shipping trade. His sanction strategy will not only affect what is happening in Ukraine and Russia, but also in the Middle East. To add something to the Middle East situation, I think there is expectation that Trump could probably end the conflict in the Middle East in a faster manner. Although I think currently it's not on top of his agenda. I think Russia and Ukraine is still sort of his priority. But there's also an sort of counter view that Trump could probably make the situation in the Middle East even worse, given sort of his unpredictability in the past. He might, for example, his maximum pressure strategy on Iran might provoke Tehran, to take some very aggressive reaction. And if Trump allows the Israel to take military actions on Iran without properly consulting with his allies in the region, then this could probably lead to a escalation of conflict in the situation. And I think there are already fears in terms of the blockage of the Hormuz Strait, which is the choke point for at least 20% of the global oil and LNG flows. This obviously will matters a lot for the shipping sector, and as well as the Red Sea disruption, the Red Sea rerouting, when that will end. I think Trump and the U.S. will also have a role to play. All being said, I think I'm obviously not a geopolitical expert, but based on my conversation with those experts, we should not ignore that a lot of the predictions regarding Trump is based on his first term. We all assume, for example, Trump will have those arbitrary actions, his unpredictability, but this time I think the situation is quite different. I think it's reasonable to expect that both Trump and his team will be more mature compared to his previous term, and this time he also has Elon Musk, on his side, who has a very very different approach towards China and globalization. If you look at what Trump, did recently, for example, inviting Xi to attend his inauguration, and as well as his remarks that there's nothing that China and the U.S. cannot solve if the two countries work together. I think he has sent some signals which are actually quite different from his first term. So when predict what his impact might be, we should not ignore sort of differences or the potential difference that he could make this time.
I think it's a really interesting point, and you and I obviously talk all the time, but we don't tend to have these conversations on podcasts all that often. And I think one of the things I'm wary of in doing the podcast and recording my bits in London and you're out there in Hong Kong is that we take a too Eurocentric view of this. And obviously Trump is a divisive character in Europe here, but also in the US, obviously. It strikes me, talking to you and talking to lots of other people based around shipping hubs in Asia, that there is a slightly more pragmatic view of Trump from the Asia side. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, exactly. Obviously, there have been a lot of concerns in terms of, the kind of disruptions that Trump might be bringing to the shipping industry. But, a lot of the people, at least who I have talked to, have also, emphasized that, Trump is a business person, right? I mean, like Biden, Trump there are more possibilities to, strike a deal with Trump if the conditions that you offer are attractive enough. So I particularly when it comes to sort of the trade war issues, as well as the regional conflicts. I guess a lot of people here in this part of the world are expecting Trump to take a more pragmatic approach, so that some of the deadlocks can be solved.
All right. How about we've done the big stuff? How about we focus a little bit more on some of the more shipping specific forecasts for next year? Now, one of the big ones obviously is shipbuilding asset prices. Asset prices right now massively high. Even if you wanted to order ships, the yards are pretty much full. And certainly in China, which I think you wrote only last month or so, now commands about 71% share of the total of everything that's been ordered. What happens in Chinese yards next year is going to be pretty pivotal. Do you think we're going to see new building prices come down? What's your forecast for next year?
Possibly. I mean, the shipyards slots are still very tight. If you want place an order today, you're probably gonna have to wait until 2028 for delivery, which means that yards are still in a very good position when it comes to their bargaining power, which means that it is not easy for the ship price to come down, at least in a fast manner. Despite sort of the lofty order books, I think the shift in the freight markets, which we have witnessed at least in the tanker and the bulker markets over the past few months, is as well as the potential slowdown in the shipping green transition, which Richard, you hinted sort of just a moment ago, are, I think, accumulating the risk of overcapacity, especially when it comes to the fact that so many sort of collapsed the Chinese yards have brought back to life over the past 12 months. We've seen sort of already quite a string of sort of Chinese idled yards being revived, as well as quite a few expansion projects of the established Chinese shipbuilders. Maybe one of the most starking example is the Henley Heavy Industry, which is a private Chinese shipyard reborn from the restructuring of STX Dalian. The yard is now actually pursuing a backdoor listing in Shanghai. And they claimed that they have had an order book of 180 vessels or something. That was sort of established in a very short period of time. I think around 18 months, but certainly less than 2 years. But it is quite. I think there are doubts within the industry in terms of how many of those orders have secured refund guarantee from banks, which means that if there are no refund guarantees for a lot of those orders, which means that those orders are not firmed up. But at the same time, that shipyard has been very, very aggressively in expanding its capacity. What I'm trying to say is that I, I don't think there's a immediate threat in terms of overcapacity, but the risk is obviously accumulating. Um, and don't forget that when it comes to the Chinese yard, uh, when you face these U.S. tariffs next year, I mean there's already expectation that the Chinese RMB currency exchange rate against the US dollar is going to depreciate next year. So this also gives Chinese yards room to lower their prices.
I don't think it's necessarily also just about how many ships are ordered next year. I think the other big factor that we need to think about is what types of ships. And what I think we are seeing in terms of some of the industry conversations right now is that we've got the MEPC decision around carbon pricing. Once that's happened, we'll know what the future looks like. And I don't think it's going to be that binary. And I certainly don't think we're going to see a rush towards dual fuel ammonia, dual fuel green methanol off the back of that decision, at least not next year. I think it'll take a few years to flush through. When Lloyd's List readers were polled in December on what fuel type they were going to choose if they were forced to order next year, as many of them will, because let's not be forgetting, we are looking in some sectors at quite an old fleet because lots of people have been holding off on ordering ships. But 32% said LNG, 24% said conventional fuel. So the vast majority of people are looking either at conventional LNG dual fuel as established fuel types. So I think, more efficient, yes, but I don't necessarily think we're going to see an immediate rush towards green fuel supplies that don't exist, because I don't think anybody is necessarily expecting an immediate rush of investment to come and result in guaranteed fuel supplies. I think that is still making people hold off on certain decisions. So, the yard equation is interesting, but actually the fuel mix, I think, is going to be erring towards fuel pragmatism is, I think, the phrase we've been using in Lloyd's List for the last 6 months. And I think that is very much bedded in as a trend for 2025 and probably into 26 as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, that's a very good point. But I also want to add that to your point, there's a relevant matter in terms of, the fragmented, green regulatory frameworks going forward if, the IMO fails to deliver. I think there have already been talks, within China in terms of, following the EU lead to implement its own carbon pricing mechanism in order to sort of speed up the transition. I mean, we've already heard some of the high-level Chinese academics speaking, who are also, government policy advisors, speaking publicly, that, Beijing should include shipping into its own carbon markets. And also privately, I think there are sort of demand from certain industries, especially, say, the shipbuilding industry as well as the fuel production industry, to sort of require the government to consider such type of, policies. You've seen sort of companies and the governments, for example, in Hong Kong and the nearby sort of Guangdong area, their aim to develop themselves into a green fuel hubs, and also sort of consider sort of implementing regional carbon levies for shippings. So I guess if the IMO fails to deliver, then the chance is the odds are actually quite big that you probably will see more regional regulations going forward. And China is certainly sort of on the radar.
Josh, you asked us for predictions, and I would say my other big prediction, and I'm going to hedge my bets here in the most horrendous journalistic fence-sitting type of way, is that we see the shipping industry divide even more polarized than it currently is at the top and the bottom. And I see that in terms of transparency, and I see that in terms of risk. So at the top, you've got an industry that is essentially jumping through hoops to hit regulatory targets, to decarbonize, digitalize, to deal with probably the most complex onslaught of regulatory requirements that the industry has ever seen. And it is increasing exponentially every year we talk about this. And the business of ship owning and ship operating has never been more complex than it is right now. From dealing with carbon pricing and trading emissions to getting your head around fuel EU maritime and the pooling mechanisms and the various calculations and permutations of that. And then at the same time, at the bottom, you've got a fleet of ships that is essentially sailing not just outside of those regulations, but with complete impunity in terms of safety standards, insurance, basically outside of any kind of rules-based order that the industry has sort of relied on in terms of its global trading standards for the last 50-odd years. So I think that is going to get more pronounced. And as a result, unfortunately, I'm going to end on a bit of a dark note. I think we are going to see the consequence of that. And I think we have seen accidents happen already, but I think it is going to take a major casualty, probably on a European shore, arguably within the Baltic or the Mediterranean. And at that point, I think it is going to become exposed that we have made shipping less safe as a result of the economic warfare that is going on. Sanctions have made shipping more risky. And I think it is now, unfortunately, an inevitability that we will see a major disaster happen as a result of the dark fleet. And the public response to that is going to be outcry that we have sat there knowing that this is going to happen and been able to do nothing about it. So I think that is unfortunately where I see the prediction happening. I think we're going to see a very angry public response when the dark fleet suddenly results in a major oil spill.
And that's where we're going to wrap this one up. Thank you so much to Richard and Cichen, and more importantly, thank you to you for listening. We'll be back very soon with another episode in this series, but if you can't wait until then, remember, you can access every episode ever of the Lloyd's List podcast on SoundCloud, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast from. They're also all available to listen to in the Lloyd's List app. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll speak to you again very soon.